He sat there, leaning back in his chair like he owned the courtroom, that same cold grin plastered across his face. The cameras caught every smirk, every sideways glance he threw at the jury. To anyone watching, it looked like he wasn't worried at all. He wasn't scared. He thought this was just another show, another round he could win with charm and manipulation, but this wasn't a game. This was a murder trial. And behind that grin was a young man who believed he could outsmart everyone, the detectives, the judge, even the law itself. He thought he was untouchable. The case had started like something out of a nightmare. 2 young men found dead, burned beyond recognition, their lives taken in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. What began as a mystery would soon spiral into one of the most chilling stories of arrogance, betrayal, and justice the state had ever seen, because the killer didn't just leave behind evidence, he left behind witnesses. And one of them, a friend who had once sworn loyalty, was about to shatter everything. This is the story of Bryce Harris, the boy who smiled through his trial, mocked the court, and thought he'd walk free, until the one person he trusted most decided to tell the truth. What happened next would wipe that smirk off his face forever. She sat back in the courtroom, arms folded, her face fixed with that smug little smile that had followed him since the day of his arrest. But he didn't flinch. Bryce Rhodes sat there like he owned the room, chin high, smirk barely hiding his arrogance. To him, this wasn't a murder trial. It was a performance. The cameras, the attention, the whispers, he fed off it. Every glare from the victims' families, every frustrated sigh from the prosecution only seemed to make him bolder. And when the judge warned him to mind his attitude, he didn't hold back. "It's not a crime to smile," he shot back, his tone casual, almost mocking. The courtroom went silent for a beat, that thick, uneasy kind of silence where everyone's waiting for someone else to speak. Then the judge leaned forward, her voice cool but sharp. "It doesn't help you to irritate people, Mr. Rhodes." He shrugged. "I'll do what I want." And just like that, the tension snapped. This was how Bryce played the game, taunting, smirking, acting untouchable. But beneath that confidence, something was shifting. Because outside that courtroom, the walls were closing in. And inside, among those watching him, was a man who knew everything. Every word, every scream, every decision Bryce thought he had buried forever. That man was about to take the stand and destroy the illusion Bryce had built piece by piece. Back in 2016, Louisville had been shaken by a story so senseless, so brutal, that even seasoned detectives struggled to make sense of it. 3 lives intertwined by friendship, fear, and violence. 2 of them young, barely teenagers, and 1 man who believed he could outthink everyone. Bryce Rhodes wasn't just some guy from the neighborhood. He was a rising name in the local rap scene, flashy, loud, known for his swagger, his charisma, and his defiance. People said he had charm, the kind that could turn heads in a room and make people believe in him, even when they shouldn't. When police first brought him in for questioning, Bryce didn't seem nervous. He wasn't pacing or panicking. He sat still, calm, talking like someone who knew the rules and knew how to bend them. He claimed innocence from the start, saying the cops were wasting their time, that he had nothing to do with what happened to those 2 boys. "You got the wrong guy," he told them. "I didn't touch nobody." And for a while, it looked like he might actually get away with it. The evidence was thin. No clear surveillance, no witnesses willing to step forward, and a crime scene that had been burned beyond recognition. Investigators were working blind, piecing together fragments, bits of DNA, a few digital traces, whispers from the streets, but nothing solid enough to bring the full truth to light. As weeks turned into months, Bryce began to look untouchable. His attorneys painted him as a victim of circumstance, someone caught up in rumors and lies. And the longer it went on, the more confident he became. He walked into court like it was a stage, dressed sharp, shoulders squared, smiling at cameras as if they were fans instead of reporters. He'd lean back during testimony, whisper jokes under his breath, laugh at things no one else found funny. To the families sitting just feet away from him, the mothers, the fathers, the siblings of the victims, it was unbearable. They watched as the man accused of killing their sons mocked the very process meant to bring justice. It was cruel, it was deliberate, and it was exactly what Bryce wanted. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room could see, was that someone who had been part of his world was breaking under the weight of what they'd seen. His name was Antoine Carter. To outsiders, he was just another face in the background, one of Bryce's friends, part of his crew. But behind that quiet demeanor was a storm of guilt and fear. For years he'd kept silent. He'd followed the unspoken rule of the streets, never talk, never betray. But every time he closed his eyes, the images came back. The voices, the begging, the final moments of two boys who had trusted the wrong people. Antoine had been there. He'd watched things unfold inside that apartment, the night when everything went too far. He remembered how it started like any other evening. The music loud, the air thick with smoke, laughter mixing with the sound of bottles clinking on the counter. But beneath it all there was tension, a spark waiting to ignite. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and suddenly a knife appeared. From that point everything blurred into chaos. Bryce had control. He commanded the room like a director giving orders, and everyone followed, whether from fear, loyalty, or both. Antoine would later describe it as being trapped in a nightmare you couldn't wake from, where every move was dictated by someone else's rage. When it was over, there were bodies. Two teenagers, Larry and Maurice, who would never make it home again. Bryce thought he had cleaned everything up. The bodies burned, the evidence gone, the witnesses silent. He thought he was smarter, colder, too careful to ever be caught. But time has a way of loosening tongues, especially when guilt festers in silence. And years later, when Antoine Carter stepped into that courtroom and locked eyes with Bryce, something shifted in the air. The same man who had smirked his way through every hearing suddenly sat still. No grin, no confidence, just silence. Antoine was sworn in, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier with every word. What he revealed would unravel everything Bryce Rhodes had built, the lies, the manipulation, the illusion of control. Because while Bryce thought loyalty would protect him, he'd forgotten one thing: fear fades, but guilt doesn't, and the truth, once it starts to surface, doesn't stop. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. The jurors leaned forward, their faces tense, their eyes locked on the young man sitting in the witness box. Antoine Carter looked nothing like the cold, confident person people expected to see. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone, his voice low but clear. "He made Maurice get on his knees," he began. The words seemed to freeze the air in the room. He made him beg for forgiveness. The audience held their breath. Reporters stopped typing. Even Bryce, who had spent months mocking the process, stopped smiling. Antoine didn't look at him at first. He stared down at his hands, his eyes heavy with the kind of guilt that never goes away. He described how Bryce covered Maurice's head with a towel, shoved a rag into his mouth, and ordered everyone else to take part. "He told us to stab him," Antoine whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. "He made me do it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, there were details, raw, horrifying details that no detective's theory could match. Antoine said he stabbed Maurice once or twice, too scared to resist, too terrified to refuse. "If I didn't," he said, "I'd be next." The words echoed, bouncing off the walls of the courtroom, carving themselves into every listener's memory. The prosecutor let him speak, not interrupting, not pushing too hard. Antoine's testimony wasn't just evidence. It was confession, memory, and nightmare tangled together. He said that night had started like any other. A group of them, Bryce, Maurice, Larry, and a few others, hanging out, smoking, drinking, laughing. But there had been tension brewing. Maurice and one of the others got into an argument, voices rising, faces flushed with anger. "It wasn't serious at first," Antoine said. "People argue all the time." But then Maurice picked up a knife. That changed everything. Bryce took the knife from him and smacked him, not out of fear, but dominance. He said he was going to violate him, Antoine recalled. The way he said it made the phrase sound darker, heavier. To the people in that room, it was clear this wasn't just an argument gone wrong. It was control, power. Bryce had taken charge and everyone else had followed. According to Antoine, Bryce called for a vote, a twisted, chilling decision. He said we should vote on whether they live or die. The prosecutor paused, letting the words settle in. "And what was your vote?" she asked quietly. Antoine swallowed hard. "I said no, but then I said yes." His voice broke as he said it. "I was scared. I didn't want to die." People in the gallery wiped their eyes. Some turned away. Others stared at Bryce, who now sat stone-faced, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. For all the smirking and mocking he had done in earlier hearings, there was no laughter left. Just that silent realization that his past was being laid bare in front of everyone. Antoine went on, describing the most horrifying moments of that night. Maurice, bound and gagged, trying to make noise but unable to speak. Bryce standing over him, stabbing him again and again. "He hit him in the chest first, with his fists," Antoine said. "Then Tyrone passed him the knife." The prosecutor asked how many times Bryce stabbed him. Antoine shook his head. "I don't know," until he stopped breathing. "There was blood. Not as much as you'd think," Antoine explained, "because they'd set up sheets and towels to catch it." "He thought of everything," he said quietly. "He didn't want a mess." The audience shifted uneasily, realizing the level of calculation in those words. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't panic. It was methodical. After Maurice was gone, Antoine said they brought out Larry, his younger brother. He didn't know yet that Maurice was already dead. "They tied his hands behind his back," Antoine said, "put a sock in his mouth, covered his head." By then, it was too late for mercy. Larry started to struggle, trying to free his hands, trying to shout, but his voice was muffled. When he realized his brother wasn't moving, Antoine said, he started to panic, but Bryce didn't stop. The prosecutor's voice softened. "Did Bryce stab him too?" Antoine nodded. "Yeah, he stabbed him, until he stopped moving." His words were simple, but the weight behind them filled the room. Then came the moment that broke everyone, when Antoine revealed that Bryce had forced each of them to stab the boys after they were already dead. He said, "We all in this now," Antoine recited, his eyes glistening. "So we all had to stab them, so nobody could say they didn't do it. It was the ultimate manipulation, binding them to his crime so no one could ever testify against him. Or so he thought." When the prosecutor asked why he followed those orders, Antoine's answer was quiet. "Because if I didn't, I'd be dead too." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The judge's face was unreadable, but her eyes flickered with disbelief. Bryce kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his hands clasped tightly, the faint smirk from before now gone completely. Antoine went on to describe how they cleaned up the scene, wrapping the bodies, dragging them to the door, and loading them into containers. They were later taken to an abandoned property and set on fire. The words, "burn the bandeau," came from Antoine's mouth like an echo from hell. When investigators had found the charred remains years before, they couldn't have known this was what had really happened, that the victim's last moments had been so deliberate, so cruel. Antoine's testimony didn't just expose a crime, it tore down the myth Bryce had built about himself. The myth that he was smarter, stronger, untouchable. By the time Antoine finished, the entire courtroom could feel it. The illusion was over. The truth had finally found its voice. Bryce's head lowered slightly. For the first time since his trial began, he looked small, not powerful, not confident. Just a man sitting in a room full of people who finally knew everything. The next morning, the courtroom was heavier than before. Not with noise, but with the weight of everything Antoine Carter had said. Reporters called it one of the most chilling testimonies in years. People who'd followed the case since the beginning finally understood why detectives looked haunted whenever they spoke about it. But for Bryce, it wasn't over. He sat there, calm on the surface, yet his eyes betrayed something new. Fear, not the kind that makes you run, the kind that seeps in when you realize there's nowhere left to go. The prosecution began laying out the rest of the evidence piece by piece, rebuilding the story Antoine had told, but now with proof to back it up. They showed photos of the abandoned house where the boys' bodies had been found, burned almost beyond recognition. They played surveillance footage, tracking the suspect's movements that night. One clip showed Bryce laughing outside a convenience store, hours after the murders. Another showed him tossing something into a dumpster behind a gas station. It wasn't until investigators searched that exact spot that they found part of a blood-stained towel, melted plastic, and a broken knife handle. Every frame, every photo, every word painted the same picture. Cold, calculated violence, followed by a performance of innocence. The prosecutor moved carefully, letting the images do most of the talking. Each one seemed to strip away another layer of Bryce's bravado. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the arrogance that had once made him think he could control the narrative. What remained was the truth, and it was brutal. Then came the moment the courtroom had been waiting for. The prosecutor turned toward the defense table. The state calls Bryce Harris to the stand. Gasps filled the room. Even his lawyer seemed taken aback. But after a brief whisper between them, Bryce stood up, buttoned his shirt collar, and walked slowly toward the witness box. The room fell completely silent. He swore in, his voice steady. The same confidence that once looked like defiance now looked like denial. A desperate performance to convince himself as much as everyone else. The prosecutor began gently, almost disarmingly. Bryce, you've heard your friend Antoine testify about what happened that night. Do you agree with his version of events? Bryce leaned toward the microphone. No, ma'am, he said, his tone controlled. Antoine's lying. He's trying to save himself. The prosecutor tilted her head slightly. And you didn't force anyone to do anything? Bryce shook his head. I didn't kill anybody. I didn't make nobody do anything. I was scared just like the rest of them. For a moment, it almost sounded believable. But then she started showing him photographs, evidence taken from his own phone, videos of him and the others laughing that night. One clip captured his voice clearly saying, "We all in this now," the very words Antoine had quoted on the stand. The jurors looked at one another. Some lowered their eyes. The prosecutor didn't need to explain the implication. The recording was time-stamped just after the murders. Bryce tried to talk his way out. That was a joke, he said quickly. We were talking about something else. But his voice cracked slightly and everyone noticed. Then came another blow, a screenshot of a text message sent from Bryce's phone the next day. Burn the bando. No evidence. The prosecutor didn't even have to ask a question. The silence after the screen lit up was enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. You told police you had nothing to do with what happened to Maurice and Larry. Is that correct? Yes, Bryce said, barely audible. But here you are on camera giving orders to destroy evidence. Why? He didn't answer. He looked down, rubbing his hands together, as if the motion could erase what everyone had just seen. His lawyer tried to object, tried to argue that context was missing, but the damage was irreversible. The prosecutor leaned closer. You said you were scared that night, Bryce. But tell me, who were you scared of? The boy on his knees begging for mercy. Or yourself? Bryce didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and for a long time he just stared at the table. In the gallery, the families of Maurice and Larry sat silently. Tears streamed down their faces, not because of the words, but because they were finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. Years of wondering, years of unanswered questions were now replaced with something more painful: clarity. After the questioning, Bryce was dismissed from the stand. As he walked back to his seat, he passed Antoine, who sat quietly, hands folded, eyes down. For a split second their eyes met, two lives forever tied together by one night of horror. Antoine looked broken, remorseful. Bryce looked hollow. When the defense began presenting its case, it was clear they had little left to work with. They painted Antoine as the real killer, claiming he had turned on Bryce to save himself. But the jury didn't buy it. Every detail, from the messages, the cleanup, the manipulation, pointed to one person orchestrating everything. Then the prosecution called one last witness, a forensic analyst. She confirmed that the partial fingerprints found on the duct tape used to bind the victims matched Bryce's, and traces of his DNA were found on the handles of both knives. "We're confident," she said, "that Mr. Harris actively participated in the murders." By the time the jury heard closing arguments, the room felt drained. The prosecution's final words hung in the air. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't panic. This was choice. Every action, every word, every order, a choice made by Bryce Harris. The defense said little. Their closing argument was short, quiet, almost resigned. They talked about reasonable doubt, about influence, about fear, but the power was gone. As the jury left to deliberate, Bryce leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, as if trying to will himself somewhere else. The smile he'd worn at the start of the trial was gone for good. All that was left was silence. Hours passed, but inside that courthouse, time seemed to stop. The jurors had been gone for almost 5 hours, yet no one moved. Reporters whispered in the back. The family sat frozen, and Bryce sat at the defense table, staring straight ahead like he could still control the outcome by sheer will. The faint sound of rain began tapping against the windows, a dull rhythm that filled the silence no one dared break. When the door finally opened and the bailiff called everyone to rise, you could feel the collective heartbeat in that room quicken. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson held a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling just slightly. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. She nodded. Bryce's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something. Probably the same line every defense attorney uses at that moment. Stay calm, no matter what happens. But Bryce didn't respond. He just clenched his jaw and stared straight ahead, his expression empty, as if he'd already decided how he'd react to whatever came next. The clerk stood and read the verdict aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder. The pause stretched on forever. "We find the defendant, Bryce Harris, guilty." A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. Someone cried out, one of the victim's relatives, unable to hold back years of grief. Another sobbed quietly, head buried in her hands. The reporter's keyboards clicked rapidly, the sound of a story breaking in real time. Bryce didn't move. For a few seconds, it was like the words hadn't reached him. Then slowly, he leaned back in his chair, let out a breath and smirked. That same smirk that had defined him since the beginning. The same one that had angered the families, unsettled the jurors, and made the judge's patience wear thin. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was defiance, one last act of control. The judge's voice broke the tension. "Mr. Harris, do you have anything to say before sentencing is pronounced?" Bryce looked up at her. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to speak. But then, instead of remorse, he laughed. Quiet at first, then louder, that cold, hollow laugh that echoed through the room. "Y'all act like you ain't know how the streets work," he muttered, voice thick with arrogance. "Everybody out there doing the same thing." "I just got caught," the gallery erupted. Gasps, shouts, someone yelled for him to stop. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Enough!" she barked. But Bryce kept smiling, eyes locked on the victims' families. It wasn't just disrespect, it was cruelty. Like he wanted his last impression to be a scar they'd carry forever. The judge stared at him for a long time. "You sit there and you laugh," she said slowly, her voice heavy with disbelief. "You mock this court, mock the families of 2 young men who lost their lives in the most brutal way imaginable. You've shown no remorse, no humanity, no understanding of what you've done." She paused, then leaned forward slightly. "But you will have the rest of your life to think about it." She picked up the papers in front of her. "For the murder of Maurice and for the murder of Larry, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The words hit like a thunderclap. For the families, it was justice. For Bryce, it was the first time he didn't look untouchable. The smirk faded. His face went blank. The deputies moved in, securing his wrists with handcuffs, the chain rattling like punctuation at the end of a long, brutal story. As they led him away, reporters shouted questions, hoping for one final quote, one last flash of arrogance. But Bryce stayed silent now. For the first time, the weight of his own choices seemed to press down on him. The door closed behind him with a heavy click, a sound that marked the end of his freedom and the beginning of his forever. Outside, the sky had turned dark, the rain coming down harder. The families of the victims stood under umbrellas, clinging to one another. Some cried, some just stared blankly ahead, numb with exhaustion. They'd waited years for this moment, years of hearings, delays, rumors, lies. And now it was over. The justice system had finally spoken, though no sentence could ever replace the lives taken. Inside the courthouse, Antoine Carter remained seated, hands trembling as he waited for his own hearing. He had turned himself in months earlier, haunted by what they'd done. His testimony had sealed Bryce's fate, and likely his own. But when the judge called his name, Antoine stood tall. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I know what I did was wrong. I can't take it back. I see their faces every night. I'm sorry." His voice cracked, and for a brief second, even the judge's expression softened. "You cooperated with the prosecution," she said, "and without your testimony, the truth might never have come out. But cooperation does not erase your participation." She handed down his sentence, 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. Antoine nodded slowly, accepting it. It wasn't freedom, but it was something close to redemption. He turned once more toward the families, before being led away, whispering a quiet "I'm sorry" that few could hear. The story dominated headlines for weeks. News outlets replayed the footage of Bryce smirking during sentencing, the kind of image that becomes burned into public memory. The face of arrogance brought to justice. Commentators debated whether he had been shaped by the streets or consumed by his own ego. Psychologists called it a complete lack of empathy. But beyond all the analysis, beyond the news and interviews, there were still two families left with nothing but memories. A pair of brothers gone forever, victims of a night fueled by control, fear, and cruelty. And as the prison gates closed behind Bryce Harris, one thing became painfully clear. The power he'd once clung to so tightly had turned to dust. He could smile, mock, laugh all he wanted, but for the rest of his life, every time those cell doors clanged shut, the sound would remind him that his world, the one he ruled with intimidation and violence, was gone for good. In the days after sentencing, the story of Bryce Harris spread like wildfire. Every headline carried his smirking mugshot, the young man who mocked the court after being found guilty of 2 brutal murders. Social media exploded with outrage, disbelief, and morbid fascination. Some called him a monster. Others said he was a product of his environment, a mirror reflecting everything broken in the world he grew up in. But behind the noise, behind the headlines and the clips, there were quieter stories. The lives forever changed by what happened that night. Maurice and Larry's family began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Their mother, who had attended every hearing, every testimony, said she finally slept for the first time in years after the verdict. Not peacefully, but without the gnawing uncertainty that had haunted her since the day her sons disappeared. "Now I know," she told a reporter softly. "Now I know what happened, and I know who did it." The reporters didn't linger long on Antoine Carter after that. He was easy to forget, the co-defendant turned witness. But inside prison walls he became something different. He was known among inmates as the one who told the truth. Some respected him for it. Others despised him, seeing betrayal where there was courage. Antoine spent most of his days in silence, keeping to himself. He read, he wrote letters to his family, and once a month he met with a prison counselor. When asked why he testified, his answer never changed. Because they deserved the truth. Somebody had to say what really happened. Meanwhile, Bryce's life behind bars began exactly the way it had ended, with arrogance. The first few weeks he carried himself like he was still in control, still feared. He'd talk loud, laugh too hard, trying to command the attention of men who had seen far worse than him. But prison has a way of stripping away illusions. No one cared who he used to be. No one was impressed by his bravado. In there, he wasn't the leader. He was just another number, another inmate serving life without parole. At night, he lay awake in his cell, replaying the trial in his head. The laughter, the verdict, the faces staring at him as the handcuffs clicked shut. The same walls that had once echoed with his defiance now echoed only with silence. His smirk, the one that had followed him through every headline, was gone. He no longer had an audience. Occasionally, he'd get letters, some from strangers fascinated by his case, others from people who wanted to understand why. None of them got answers. He'd read them once, then tear them up and toss them into the toilet. The world outside moved on. The court cases ended. The news cycle shifted. But inside those walls, time didn't move. Back in the city, the site where Maurice and Larry's bodies had been found was finally cleared and turned into something new. A small memorial garden, 2 plaques with their names, a few benches, fresh flowers left weekly by their mother. It wasn't much, but it was peaceful. And maybe peace, even in pieces, was the only thing that could come from something so senseless. Every anniversary brought people back, friends, classmates, neighbors. They'd light candles, share stories, remember who the brothers were before their names became headlines. Maurice had wanted to be a mechanic. Larry dreamed of starting a small clothing brand. They weren't saints, but they didn't deserve what happened to them. No one did. In interviews, detectives admitted that this case haunted them more than most. Not just because of the brutality, but because of the psychology behind it. The way control and fear spread like poison through that group of boys. One detective said you could see how easily it happened. How one person's ego, one person's hunger for power, could make everyone else forget their humanity. The prosecutor who put Bryce away kept a photo of the brothers on her office shelf. "They remind me why I do this," she said in an interview years later. "Because justice doesn't always heal. But sometimes it's the only thing that helps people keep going." For a while, Bryce's case became a reference point in discussions about group crimes, peer pressure, and manipulation. Psychologists studied his behavior, his lack of remorse, his calm demeanor, the smirk that made national news. Some called it narcissism, others antisocial behavior. But every expert agreed on one thing. Bryce Harris believed he was untouchable until the very end. In one rare prison interview conducted by a journalist years later, Bryce sat in an orange jumpsuit, his hair shaved short, his eyes distant. When asked why he laughed during sentencing, he shrugged. "People wanted a show," he said flatly. "I gave them one." The journalist pressed further, asking if he felt any remorse. Bryce paused, then said, "What's that supposed to do now?" There it was. The same cold indifference that had defined him since the night of the murders. But beneath that mask, there was something else. A flicker of recognition, maybe even regret, buried so deep he couldn't admit it aloud. The journalist noticed it too, the way his voice dropped slightly when he mentioned Maurice's name. Back outside the prison, life went on. The world forgot, as it always does. But for those who lived through it, the families, the investigators, the witnesses, the case never truly ended. It became a wound that time dulled but never healed. Antoine, after 2 decades, finally became eligible for parole. At his hearing, he spoke softly, his voice older, steadier. "I made the worst mistake of my life," he said. "I followed someone who didn't care about anything or anyone. And 2 people died because I didn't have the courage to say no." The board listened quietly. Whether or not they granted him release, he knew he'd already served a sentence that went beyond prison walls. The sentence of memory. As for Bryce, there would be no parole, no release. His world would forever be confined to grey walls and iron bars. Every sound of the cell door closing each night was a reminder, not just of punishment, but of the moment everything ended. He once believed power made him untouchable. But in the end, it only made his fall that much harder. The smile that once mocked the system had faded into nothingness. Years slipped by, one after another, and the case that once gripped the nation slowly faded from the headlines. New crimes took its place. New faces filled the screens. But for the people who had lived through it, the families, the witnesses, the detectives, it never really went away. Some stories don't fade. They echo. Inside the cold walls of the penitentiary, Bryce Harris grew older. The swagger that once defined him had long since vanished. Prison had a way of doing that, stripping away the illusions of control until all that was left was the person underneath. The smirk that once infuriated everyone who saw it was gone. In its place, a stillness, an emptiness that even he couldn't fake anymore. Inmates who had once feared him now ignored him. He wasn't a leader or a legend, or the clever manipulator who once made others do his bidding. He was just another man serving life with no way out. Some nights, he sat in the corner of his bunk, staring at the wall, replaying every choice that led him there. The sound of laughter from the yard, the flash of fire, the image of Morris and Larry's faces. He could push them down for years, but not forever. There were rumors that he started writing letters, not to his family, not to the media, but to the mothers of the two boys whose lives he took. He never mailed them. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was habit. Another performance without an audience. But the act of writing, of putting those words on paper, seemed to haunt him more than silence ever could. Outside those prison walls, life carried on. The memorial garden where Maurice and Larry were remembered became a place of quiet strength. Each spring, new flowers bloomed there, planted by volunteers who didn't even know the full story. Just that two young lives were lost and deserved not to be forgotten. Their mother still came every week. She brought fresh flowers, sometimes candles, sometimes just sat quietly on the bench between the two plaques. She didn't cry anymore. She didn't need to. The grief had become something else, something steadier, quieter, like a scar that no longer bleeds but never fades. Detective Warren, now retired, sometimes visited too. He'd stop by the garden when no one was around. To outsiders it was just a habit, but for him it was unfinished business. The Harris case had changed him, not because of the brutality, but because of what it revealed about fear, power, and control. He was just a kid, the detective had said once, staring down at the engraved names. But he wanted to be feared more than he wanted to be free. And maybe that's what it came down to, a boy so obsessed with control that he destroyed everything around him, believing it made him powerful. But in the end, the only thing he controlled was his own downfall. Antoine Carter, after 21 years behind bars, was finally granted parole. He stepped out of the prison gates into a world that looked nothing like the one he'd left behind. The city had changed. The people were older. But the weight of what he'd done stayed exactly the same. He didn't try to hide it. He spent his first years of freedom working with youth outreach programs, speaking to kids in rough neighborhoods, trying to stop them from following the same path. One night, he told them, one choice, that's all it takes to ruin everything. Some saw redemption in him. Others could never forgive. But maybe forgiveness wasn't the goal. Maybe the point was that he kept trying. Back in prison, Bryce stayed quiet. The years took their toll. His hair gray, his shoulders slouched, the light in his eyes fading. The guards said he didn't talk much anymore. Didn't cause trouble, didn't laugh. Just existed. The arrogance that once burned like fire had turned to ash. Occasionally, journalists still asked to interview him. Most requests went unanswered. The few times he did respond, his answers were short, almost detached. "People act like they know me," he said once. But nobody really does, and maybe that was true. Nobody would ever fully understand why he did what he did, how someone so young could be so cold, so calculated. Some blamed his environment, some his upbringing, others just said evil doesn't always come with a reason. But deep down, everyone knew that the real horror wasn't just what Bryce did, it was how easy it was for him to do it, and how convinced he'd been that he'd get away with it. That's what people remembered most. The smirk, the arrogance, the laughter in a courtroom filled with grief. The face of someone who thought he was untouchable, until his own friend turned against him, until the truth stripped him bare. There's something haunting about that moment, when confidence turns to fear, when power collapses into silence. It reminds us that justice, no matter how delayed, has a way of finding its way through the cracks. It might not heal every wound, but it speaks. It answers. In the final years of his life, Bryce rarely left his cell. He was transferred to a medical wing after suffering a stroke. The guard said he spent most days staring out the tiny window, barely speaking. And one night, as the prison slept, he quietly passed away. No family came. No visitors, just a file marked deceased and a number that would soon be reassigned. News of his death barely made headlines. A short article mentioned it online, buried under more recent tragedies. But in the small garden miles away, 2 candles flickered that same night, burning low under the soft hum of the streetlights. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something more. But for the families who lost everything, that night felt different, quieter, lighter, like the weight had finally lifted even just a little, and somewhere in that silence, the story found its ending. A young man who thought he was untouchable, brought down by his own cruelty, a friend who found redemption in truth. 2 brothers whose lives ended far too soon, but whose names would never be forgotten, because in the end, no matter how loud the lies, the truth always finds a way to speak. And when it does, it doesn't whisper, it echoes.